If there's one part of report writing that people tend to mishandle very confidently, it's visuals. I say that because visuals carry this automatic aura of professionalism. The second a chart, graph, or table appears on the page, the report starts to look more serious, more polished, more credible. And that visual impression can be so persuasive that the writer tends to gloss over the more important question, which is whether the visual is actually helping the reader understand anything at all. So, this is actually a point in a report writing where a lot of people go wrong and they often don't even realize it. Ironically, they're doing what seems reasonable as they have data, so they assume some of it should become a chart. They have numbers, so they assume a table belongs somewhere. They know reports often contain visuals, so they try to make their report look like a report. Unfortunately, this isn't the same as making good decisions. Visuals are certainly useful. The problem is that most people have no idea when to use them, when not to, or what kind they need. So what ends up happening is that a visual is inserted because the writer feels that something on the page ought to be visualized, not because the reader actually needs that information in visual form. And that distinction matters a lot more than people think because a weak visual doesn't just sit harmlessly. It actually slows the reader down by interrupting the movement of the report and creating one thing more to decode. Sometimes it repeats information that was already perfectly clear in the paragraph. Sometimes it leaves the reader doing interpretive work that the writer should have done. Sometimes it looks impressive while doing very little. So that's why this topic deserves more care than it usually gets, and it's also why I wanted to make this lecture part of the larger report writing playlist on my channel. My name is Dr. Whitney Kosters, and I am an English professor. And on this channel, I teach academic writing, literary analyses, research methods, and of course, report writing. So if you're working through a report and need help not just with visuals, but with planning, findings, structure, recommendations, executive summaries, and revision, my playlist on report writing is here to walk you through the entire process step by step. So how do you know when information should become a visual and when it should just stay in prose? The cleanest place to start is with the reader. What is the reader trying to understand at that moment in the report? Not what information do you happen to have, and not what can be turned into a graph. Ask yourself, what is the reader trying to grasp? Are they trying to see exact values? Are they trying to compare categories? Are they trying to track change over time? Are they trying to understand a process? Are they trying to weigh several options against several criteria at once? Now, those are very different jobs, and they don't all call for the same kind of visual. In fact, some of them don't call for one at all. Now, that last point is really important because people often assume that visuals are always upgrades, and that's simply not true. Sometimes the strongest choice is simply to write the sentence clearly. If your point is that one department had the highest number of complaints last quarter, that may not need a chart. If your point is that Department A had 147 complaints, Department B had 142, and Department C had 139, you may not need a chart for that either, especially if those exact numbers matter more than the visual impression. A sentence or a small table may do the job more honestly and more efficiently. But if your point is that complaints were fairly stable for months, then spiked sharply in one period, and then dropped after a policy change, now the reader is trying to understand pattern and movement, not just isolated numbers, and that's where a visual can become genuinely helpful. So here is a practical way to think through the choice. If exact numbers matter, a table is often the best option. Tables are useful when the reader may need to locate a specific figure, compare values carefully, or return to the data later. They're slower than charts, but that's not a weakness if precision is the priority. A table doesn't force a visual impression first. It lets the reader inspect the numbers. Now, if the point is comparison across categories, a bar chart often works well. A bar chart is useful when the reader needs to see which option is higher, lower, larger, smaller, more expensive, more common, less common, and so on. The strength of the bar chart is that it makes comparison quick, as the reader doesn't have to hold several numbers in memory and mentally compare them. Now, if time is the point, use a line graph. That's one of the simplest and most useful rules to remember. When your report is trying to show increase, decline, fluctuation, seasonality, or stability across time, a line graph is usually the better choice because it lets the reader see shape. And shape really matters because it shows whether something rose slowly or suddenly, whether a drop was brief or sustained, whether a trend held steady or changed direction. Those are things readers can technically gather from a paragraph full of numbers, but they'll usually grasp them much faster from a well-designed line graph. If the report is explaining how something moves from one step to another, a process visual may be more useful than either a chart or a table. This is where flowcharts, timelines, and diagrams become helpful. If the reader needs to understand the sequence of events in an approval process, a hiring workflow, a safety procedure, an intake system, or some other stage process, that kind of information is often easier to follow visually because sequence is the whole point. And if the report is evaluating multiple options across multiple criteria, comparison tables or matrices are often the strongest choice. Imagine trying to compare 3 software systems across cost, implementation time, training demands, compatibility, security risk, and maintenance needs entirely in prose. It can be done, of course, but it creates a lot of strain for the reader because the comparison is scattered across paragraphs. A matrix pulls the trade-offs into one place so that the reader can see them together. Now, knowing what kind of visual to choose is only half the issue because even a decent visual can fail if the writing around it is weak. This is where a lot of students, and quite frankly, a lot of professionals, underestimate what's required. They insert a chart and then assume it will speak for itself. And I'm here to tell you it will not and it cannot. A visual without framing is often ambiguous, and ambiguity is not what most reports need, because reports are supposed to reduce unnecessary guesswork, not introduce more of it. What the writing about the visual needs to do is actually pretty simple, but a lot of people just skip both parts. Before the visual appears, the reader needs to know why they are about to look at it. After the visual appears, the reader needs to know what matters in it. Those two things completely change how useful the visual becomes. So I'll show you the difference. If a report says Figure 2 shows monthly response times, that's technically fine, but it's very thin. It names the figure, but it doesn't tell the reader why it's there. A stronger sentence would do a little more work. It might say something like, to see whether the increase in response times was brief or sustained, Figure 2 compares monthly response times across the full calendar year. So now the reader knows what question the visual is helping answer, and they can arrive with a purpose. Then after the visual, the report needs to interpret it. Not every feature, not a tedious walk through each point, just the important thing. So instead of dropping the figure in and moving on, the report should say, response times remain fairly stable through the spring, then rise sharply in July and August, which suggests the problem is concentrated during peak demand rather than spread evenly across the year. So that sentence tells the reader what to notice and why it matters. At that point, the visual is doing real work inside the report rather than just appearing on the page like an ornament made of data. This also brings us to a problem that deserves more attention than it usually gets, which is that visuals can mislead very quickly, even when the data itself is accurate. That can happen through scale, grouping, labeling, omission, clutter, and color choices, through all kinds of decisions that seem minor but shape perception in quite powerful ways. If a graph exaggerates a very small difference by compressing the axis, the visual impression becomes disproportionate. If categories are grouped too broadly, important variation disappears. If labels are vague, the reader may not be sure what is being compared. If a title is generic, the reader gets very little help orienting themselves. So that's why I want to be clear that visuals are not neutral just because they look factual. They are designed objects. Someone chooses the format, the scale, what data to include, what to leave out, how to group the categories, how much detail to show, and where to place the visual in the report itself. Those choices shape interpretation whether the writer is aware of it or not. And placement matters more than people realize. A visual should usually appear close to the paragraph that introduces and explains it. If the reader has to keep flipping pages to match the discussion with the figure, the report becomes harder to use. Now, the same is true of titles. Figure 1, survey results, does very little. It names the object, but it doesn't help the reader understand why that figure matters. A stronger title gives the reader direction in that it provides context and tells them what they are about to see. When you revise your own report, one of the best things you can do is ask a set of very blunt questions. Why is this visual here? What is it helping the reader understand? Is this the clearest format for this information, or just the first format that came to mind? Would the report actually lose anything if I removed it? Did I tell the reader why they were looking at it? Did I tell them what mattered in it? These questions are useful because they force judgment, and good report writing depends on judgment a lot more than people realize. Sometimes those questions will confirm that the visual is doing exactly what it should do. Other times, they're going to show you that the chart should have been a table. The table should have been a sentence. The sentence should have been expanded into a process diagram, or the visual should just disappear altogether. These changes determine how readable a report is, how much work the reader has to do, and whether the document feels helpful or just frustrating. And that really is the standard worth keeping in mind. A strong visual reduces work for the reader. A weak visual creates more of it. So if you remember that, you are definitely going to make better decisions. As always, thank you so much for joining me here today. If this lecture helped clarify something that had previously felt vague or confusing to you, make sure you check out the full report writing playlist on my channel, because this is just one piece of a much bigger process, and I've built that playlist to help people through every single stage of it. Thanks so much for joining me here today, as always, and I will see you guys in the next lecture. Be well.